The unconscious is back. Why now? Certainly, it ruptured into consciousness in the days and months following 7th October 2023, when the Israeli death machine let loose on Gaza, accelerating into a genocide of the Palestinian people that has cost Israel a measure of its international legitimacy and led to the prolonged captivity of hostages, death of hostages, rising anti-Semitism, and an exodus of Israel's educated elite. The Israeli state performs these self-defeating operations under the sign of Jewish safety, and for that reason with the widespread approval of Jews in Israel and much of the global diaspora. Denials of the reality of genocide mask a deeper libidinal investment in its perpetration. In June 2024, the right-wing politician Moshe Feiglin took to television to invoke Hitler. Quote, "As Hitler once said, I cannot live in this world if there is one Jew left in it. We could not live in this land if even one such Islamo-Nazi remains in Gaza, and not before we return to Gaza and turn it into Hebrew Gaza." As Jake Rom wrote in Parapraxis, a magazine founded in 2022, dedicated to psychoanalysis and left politics, quote, "Temporalities and geographies mix and collapse in the rooms of the crematoria and emerge reformed from the barrel of a gun in Gaza. The refusal of genocide's repetition, never again, becomes the mandate for its inverted return. Yes, again, genocide. Palestinians must now excavate and rebury the bodies of their dead amidst the ruins of war. The difficulty of the task arises not just from its magnitude, how to grieve 67,000 people, a third of them children, but also from an ongoing occupation that erodes the psychic conditions necessary for mourning. For Freud, the work of mourning requires time, in which the ego can discover the reality of its loss and then choose its own life. But under occupation, loss is continuous, and the time for mourning never arrives. What is occupation? The Palestinian writer Abdeljawad Omar asks, but a collective state of perpetual deferral of mourning. But surely the unconscious had made its presence felt even earlier in another ongoing war, one perpetrated by a coalition of authoritarian strongmen, feminists, conservative clerics, and manosphere influencers. Freud says the dream expresses a wish. We can say the same of war. What wish does the war against so-called gender ideology express? There is again the wish for total safety. In her 2021 book, Material Girls, Why Reality Matters for Feminism, Kathleen Stock argues that being trans should be legally protected as a species of gender non-conforming behavior, but only, Stock qualified, to the extent that trans rights do not threaten the safety of non-trans women. And this means for Stock not just the familiar demand to exclude trans women from women's-only spaces. It means that trans women have no right to use female pronouns. For the expectation that I, a non-trans woman, use she and her for someone who I suspect might be biologically male can operate, Stock says, like cognitive rehypnol, slowing down my mental processes and making me more susceptible to violence, the violence, that is, of trans women. So total is the cis woman's right to safety that she cannot be asked to stop and think of the other. Just as the total right to Jewish safety means that any appeal to the dignity of Palestinian life is already an anti-Semitic assault. Vladimir Putin, like many authoritarian leaders, a hero of the gender wars, longs for the restoration of the Russian Empire as a means, he says, to bezopasnost, total security, literally the absence of threat. But there is a deeper wish still contained in the war on gender ideology. Like all our deepest wishes, it is an unthinkable wish, and so Freud says, one that must be repressed from consciousness. Indeed, for Freud, it's the deepest of all wishes, not the Oedipal wish to sleep with your mother and kill your father, but the wish to be both mother and father, to transcend what Freud called the great antithesis of male and female. The trans person reminds us of this denied wish, and so reveals that our sense of ourselves as simply a woman or a man is, in the words of Jacqueline Rose, quote, the outcome of multiple repressions whose unlived stories surface nightly in our dreams. The trans person is the chimera we all desire and dread. It's no surprise, then, that the increasing visibility of trans life has led to the reassertion of sex as a self-evident biological distinction, underwriting a natural social hierarchy. Nor is it a surprise that this reassertion has been central to the global advancement of the far right. On the day of his second inauguration, Donald Trump signed an executive order titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. The order affirms that there are only two sexes as a matter of immutable biological reality, that men are biological males and women biological females, and that any suggestion otherwise has, quote, a corrosive impact on the validity of the entire American system. So declared the reinstated father, who promises to undo the psychic castration suffered by straight white men at the hands of feminist women, immigrants, and DEI initiatives, who promises to restore the rule of fathers everywhere. In fact, though, the unconscious never left the scene. It is the unconscious, psychoanalysis tells us, that sets the scene. What has returned of late is not the unconscious itself, but the felt need for the unconscious and its workings as a diagnostic tool, as an explanans for the explanandum of irrationalism that everywhere seems to have taken hold. We need, many feel, to go beyond talk of parties and platforms, of beliefs and values, of jobs and wages, class and exploitation. We need to speak of fantasies and their repression, libido and the death drive, disavowal and displacement, trauma and its disfiguring aftermath. To what end? Notwithstanding over a century's worth of debate about the epistemic credentials of psychoanalysis, I take its explanatory power to be self-evident. You may not want to commit yourself ontologically to some thing called the unconscious, and you may object to many of the details of the orthodox Freudian picture. For example, the idea of penis envy, as Simone de Beauvoir complained, seems to assume precisely what's to be explained. But can we really doubt that there is more, much more, to our individual and collective lives than that of which we are consciously aware? Do we doubt that each of us encounters reality not directly, but through the thicket of our individual psychic realities, the vast sediment of our past histories? That, to put it mundanely but not inaccurately, each of us brings with us a hell of a lot of baggage. The interesting question to my mind is not whether there is truth in psychoanalysis, but whether its truth will set us free. This might seem an odd question for a philosopher to ask. We philosophers tend to be preoccupied with questions of truth. But insofar as a philosopher or anyone really is interested in politics, interested in not just describing the world but changing it, the real question is whether psychoanalysis can liberate us, not just from the violent divisions of our individual psyches, but from the violent divisions and resulting despair of our political moment. There is reason for doubt. Psychoanalysis was born of a retreat from politics. In the 1880s, Austrian liberal hegemony, with its confident ideology of European reason and social progress, was threatened by the emergence of new mass parties that channeled various anti-liberal currents: Christian, anti-Semitic, socialist, and nationalist. In 1895, the liberal bastion of Vienna voted Karl Lueger, an anti-Semite and reactionary Catholic, as mayor. The emperor, disliking Lueger's anti-Semitism, refused to ratify the election. Freud, a liberal and a Jew, smoked a cigar in celebration. But 2 years later, in 1897, the emperor bowed to the popular will, and Lueger became mayor, bringing the liberal era to an end. Describing these dying days of 19th century Austria, the historian Karl Schorsky writes, quote, "Anxiety, impotence, a heightened awareness of the brutality of social existence. These features assumed new centrality in a social climate where the creed of liberalism was being shattered by events." Psychoanalysis then was born of a moment not dissimilar to our own, in which the image of the human as a rational animal seemed fragile, if not preposterous, and the progressive liberalism founded on that image revealed as dangerously naive. In turning inwards the drama of the human psyche, Freud was part of a fin de siècle culture of individual self-cultivation, which had resulted from political paralysis. Freud took this focus on inner feeling, combined it with the scientific rationalism of mid-century liberalism, and created in psychoanalysis a theory that offered at once a powerful reckoning with human irrationalism and a welcome refuge from its terrifying political manifestations. For Freud, the task of psychoanalysis is to help the patient unearth the origins of her neurotic symptom, finding at its root some unbearable idea that has been repressed by the conscious self into the unconscious. The analyst thereby promises to give his patient a greater measure of freedom with which to decide what to do with her previously unthinkable thought. Say it's a thought like, "I wish to destroy my father and sleep with my mother." And to make things more interesting, let's say that the patient is a woman. Through the process that Freud calls working through, she comes to know the wish she has long repressed and finds herself in a position to do something with this knowledge. She may accept the reality of her wish and act on it, embracing lesbianism. Or she may accept that her wish cannot be acted on, not without grave social sanction, and so set it aside, substituting her desire to displace her father for, say, a desire to have a son. Psychoanalysis, in its orthodox Freudian form, makes no judgment between these options. This isn't a comment on Freud's own social views. In fact, he was an advocate for the loosening of the taboo against homosexuality, but rather a corollary of the principle that what matters psychoanalytically is not external reality, but the individual's psychic representation of it. So it follows that Freud's many, many feminist critics, including Simone de Beauvoir, Betty Friedan, and Kate Millett, were both right and wrong to charge Freud with encouraging women to adjust themselves to their patriarchal realities. As Juliet Mitchell observes in her 1974 classic, Psychoanalysis and Feminism, Freud charts a principled indifference between social accommodation and resistance. The task is to help the patient put her own psychic reality in better order, an achievement which is compatible with multiple relations to social reality. So it's a mistake, Mitchell says, to read Freud as a proponent of patriarchal morality, telling women they would be happy if only they accepted the dull pleasures of wifely and maternal duty. At the same time, feminists are right in that Freudian psychoanalysis sees nothing disturbing in the woman who, perhaps against the odds, remedies her neurosis by embracing the role patriarchy has assigned her, much less that patriarchy is a moral disaster that must be collectively overcome. Psychoanalysis is individualistic, not only at the level of practice as an intimate encounter between patient and analyst, but also in its theoretical focus on the inner life of the patient. And yet, many powerful radical thinkers since Freud, Wilhelm Reich, Herbert Marcuse, Theodore Adorno, Franz Fanon, Edward Said, Shulamith Firestone, Juliet Mitchell, Jacqueline Rose, Judith Butler, have seen psychoanalysis as a tool of social liberation from the psychically disfiguring systems of fascism, capitalism, colonialism, racism, and patriarchy. And recently, a younger left has rediscovered in psychoanalysis a powerful framework of political critique. The pages of Power Praxis, for example, seem a confirmation of what an older generation of theorists have long said, that the missing term in radical politics is psyche. Freud himself took an eventual turn towards politics, one impelled by the ravages of the First World War. In 1919, the Social Democrats prevailed over their various reactionary opponents, winning the right to govern Red Vienna. They made deep investments in social housing, adult education, and child welfare centers, winning over disaffected liberals, Freud among them. At the same time, and reversing his pre-war position that analysts should charge for their services, Freud called for the creation of free clinics. Vienna's own free clinic, the Ambulatorium, opened in 1922. All the most important second-generation psychoanalysts, Wilhelm Reich, Erich Fromm, Otto Fennekel, Karen Horney, Melanie Klein, Anna Freud, served in free clinics, providing analysis for poor and working-class patients. Unlike the liberal Freud, these younger Freudians tended to be socialists or Marxists. Under the de facto leadership of Reich, a committed communist, they debated how best to synthesize psychoanalysis with politics. Reich himself, wanting to prevent and not just merely treat neurosis, began a mobile clinic that offered free sex education, contraceptives, and Marxist instruction. Reich's efforts would grow into his sex pole movement, whose motto was free sexuality within an egalitarian society. For Reich, all neurosis was created by the social suppression of a naturally free and healthy sexuality, and all sexual suppression was the result of a particular economic form, capitalism. With this simple formula, Reich brought together Marx and Freud, albeit at the cost of Freud's most fundamental commitments: that the Oedipus complex is a universal event of childhood, produced not by any particular familial arrangement, but by the subject's need to constitute itself in a world of taboo and prohibition, and that, so it follows, repression is the precondition of civilization as such, capitalist or not. For Reich, the utopian, sexual and political liberation went hand in hand. For Freud, who was more than a liberal or a progressive, a tragedian, it could never be so simple. Reich attempted to politicize psychoanalysis, democratizing and socializing it, and also tried to psychoanalyze politics. In The Mass Psychology of Fascism, Reich sought to explain why Europe's working classes in the 1920s and 30s were drawn to fascism. To blame, he said, was the patriarchal family whose sexual repressiveness produced unsatisfied longings in its members, all too easily channeled by authoritarian strongmen and blood and soil mysticism. The book was published in 1933, the same year that Hitler became chancellor. In a doomed attempt to save psychoanalysis from Nazi inquisition, Freud and his more conservative associates denied that psychoanalysis had anything to do with politics. In a letter to Ernest Jones, the president of the International Psychoanalytic Association, Anna Freud explained that what her father found, quote, offensive in Reich is the fact that he has forced psychoanalysis to become political. Psychoanalysis has no part in politics. A year later, Reich was formally expelled from the Psychoanalytic Association. This and other appeasement measures did not prevent the Nazis from Aryanizing psychoanalysis. They burned Freud's books and absorbed Berlin's free clinic into the Nazi death apparatus. In 1938, Freud fled to London. 3 of his 5 sisters were killed in Treblinka. Of the dual ambitions shared by Reich and the other political Freudians to politicize psychoanalysis and psychoanalyze politics, it is the latter that has been more fully realized. This is not to forget the important attempts to politically reimagine psychoanalysis and mental health care more broadly. In the 1950s, Frantz Fanon, before he became the fiery spokesman of the Algerian Revolution, revolutionized the psychiatric clinic. Prior to his arrival there, the Blido-Joinville Hospital was a typical example of the so-called Algiers School of colonial ethnopsychiatry, founded on the premise that Algerians were constitutionally primitive. A fierce critic of racial essentialism, Fanon worked to transform the hospital into a place where patients could, quote, rediscover the meaning of freedom. He set up a Moorish cafe where his Algerian patients drank coffee and played cards, and he also built a football field still in use today. In an article on these efforts, Fanon wrote, quote, a revolutionary attitude was essential. It was necessary to go from a position in which the supremacy of Western culture was evident to one of cultural relativism. Increasingly, however, Fanon became convinced that the psychiatric hospital, however much endowed with a culturally specific sociality, quote, condemns the patient to exercise his freedom in the unreal world of fantasy. The asylum could not de-alienate the mad patient. Only by emancipating the mad person from forced confinement could the meeting of doctor and patient be, quote, an encounter between 2 freedoms. In his final days, as the Algerian Revolution raged, Fanon created an outpatient center in Tunis, hoping it would serve as a model of mental health care for the decolonizing world. Today, the London Clinic of Psychoanalysis, founded in 1926, continues to offer low-fee therapy to a limited number of patients. It is one of more than 250 autonomous clinics in 20 countries around the world, which offer low-fee or free psychotherapy to poor and otherwise marginalized people. In Palestine, psychoanalysis has had a long life as a liberatory praxis, one that seeks to both understand and address the ravages of occupation. The Gaza Community Mental Health Program is the largest of its kind in Gaza. Despite Israel's destruction of its centers and the death and displacement of its staff, the program continues to provide services for a population suffering from trauma that the United Nations has agreed is too chronic and unrelenting to fit the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. The program's interventions focus especially on Gaza's children, 96% of whom reported a year ago feeling that their death was imminent, and nearly half that they wanted to die. Even outside the context of genocidal war, attempts to democratize psychoanalysis always struggle with a mismatch between therapeutic supply and neurotic demand. As Freud himself warned, quote, compared to the vast amount of neurotic misery which there is in the world, the quantity we can do away with is almost negligible. Little wonder, then, that the impulse to synthesize psychoanalysis with politics has more often expressed itself in theory than in practice. It is Fanon, the diagnostician of colonial psychopathology, rather than Fanon, the caring doctor, whom we remember and revere. Many celebrated psychoanalytic readers of politics, from Marcuse to Judith Butler, are not themselves trained analysts. Knowledge makes one free was the slogan of the mid-19th century liberalism that was so formative for Freud. What knowledge do we gain when we psychoanalyze politics? For Fanon, it is that colonialism is a mutilating madness for colonist and colonized alike, that can only be overcome through a redirection of colonial violence against its perpetrators. Decolonization is at once a progressive moment in a world historical dialectic and replete with dangers of ethno-nationalism, regressive traditionalism, and elite capture. For Shulamith Firestone, Freud corrects Marx, revealing that the root cause of all oppression, economic, political, racial, sexual, is, quote, the biological family, the vinculum through which the psychology of power can always be smuggled. For Juliet Mitchell, psychoanalysis tells us that the unconscious is the seat of ideology, its mechanism of transmission and interpolation. For Jacqueline Rose, psychoanalysis warns of the perilous temptation to reify the event of trauma into the identity of victim. Perils played out for Rose in both Zionism and radical feminism. Psychoanalysis, Rose says, challenges, quote, the dualities, inside-outside, victim-aggressor, even good-evil of traditional politics, compelling us to recognize, quote, the infinite complexity of the human mind, including the minds of our oppressors. The contemporary rise of powerful far-right movements and leaders in the US, UK, Brazil, India, Philippines, Hungary, Italy, Germany, and elsewhere has turned many political thinkers, including Richard Seymour, Dagmar Herzog, and Claudia Lieb, back to the puzzle that concerned Reich and other left Freudians in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, that of the psychic allure of authoritarianism, nativism, and regressive gender norms. And like their 20th century predecessors, these contemporary thinkers find themselves reaching not just for terms like aggression and revenge, but also desire, fantasy, and pleasure. In short, what we come to know when we have psychoanalytic knowledge of politics is why things are so stubbornly as they are, the full cost of things being this way, the forms of psychic disintegration that underlie more obvious forms of economic and bodily harm, and finally a better sense of what we might hope for, what forms of life best answer to our natures as desiring, conflicted beings. Psychoanalysis can help us know all of this. And yet, in politics, we always arrive at the vexing question: how to put one's knowledge into practice, how to pull off that feat of simultaneously describing the world and changing it. Marx was wrong to suggest that so far the philosophers had only tried to do the former. In fact, philosophers have long tried and try still to do both at once. But philosophers tend to operate on the assumption, one inherited from Plato, that knowledge of the good is not just necessary, but more or less sufficient for virtuous action. In other words, that most wrongdoing comes from moral ignorance. And if this is your starting point, then it makes total sense to spend your time coming up with arguments to show that, for example, gross inequality is unjust, or that none of us has the right to destroy the earth for our own personal gain. If, however, you take a different view of things, say a more psychoanalytic view on which mechanisms of defense and disavowal often get between people's beliefs and their actions, then the philosopher's quest to change the world by morally enlightening it will seem foolhardy. Psychoanalysis is not in the business of moral enlightenment. Its knowledge is descriptive rather than prescriptive, about how and why things are rather than what they ought to be. For those who've read their Marx, this is already a step in the right direction, that is, in the direction of a theory actually capable of producing change. For example, the politically important question surely is not whether Israel's genocide is a moral abomination. Every Palestinian already knows that it is. But what practical possibilities exist for bringing it and the state of occupation that produced it to an end? To answer that question, one needs a better description of the Palestinian situation. We need what the cultural theorist Stuart Hall called a conjunctural analysis, a descriptive mapping of the forces, economic, political, social, ideological, at play in a given historical moment. A mapping that can be used to identify possibilities for practical intervention. Psychoanalysis, if you accept its basic power to describe aspects of reality, can, at least in principle, contribute to conjunctural analysis. But for Hall, not just any true description of the conjuncture will do. It may be that Israel's domination of the Palestinian people is partly driven by a history of unmetabolized trauma. But what follows? Would knowing this help the Palestinian liberation movement identify which levers to pull? Or, on the contrary, would it lead to a strategy with unintended consequences? The reification, say, of the Nazi Holocaust as a singular hypertrauma that excuses any atrocity produced in its name. The difficulty is that psychoanalytic knowledge is always knowledge of human vulnerability, of the helpless infant within, however outwardly powerful a person may be. While he was giving haven inside Blida Hospital to the Algerian rebels of the National Liberation Front, Fanon was also treating the French servicemen who were involved in torturing them. For Fanon, as his biographer Adam Schatz writes, the French torturers too were victims of a colonial system whose dirty work they were required to perform. But this did not stop Fanon from arguing in The Wretched of the Earth that decolonization required a radical inversion of the dichotomy between colonizer and colonized. The humanity of the colonized must be affirmed, and the colonist made to suffer the symbolic and material terror that he so long perpetrated. It's true that Fanon longed for a humanist future in which all men recognized each other as equals. But this future had to be achieved through a violent confrontation of radical unequals in the present. The psychoanalytic gaze, by its nature leveling and humane, could theoretically illuminate colonialism, but it could not, Fanon believed, provide the practical attitude required for the actual work of decolonization. A decade before Wretched of the Earth and 2 years before the start of the Algerian War, Fanon published Black Skin, White Masks. That book's theme was what Fanon called the massive psycho-existential complex of French colonial racism. Here, Fanon offered a more straightforward account, a more hopeful account of the political relevance of psychoanalysis. By analyzing the complex of racism, Fanon wrote, we aim to destroy it. And this destruction would be achieved through greater self-knowledge on the part of both blacks and whites. Quote, those who recognize themselves in black skin, white masks will have made a step in the right direction. Fanon's, quote, true wish was to get my brother, black or white, to shake off the dust from that lamentable livery built up over centuries of incomprehension. So here Fanon affects a simple transposition of Freud from an individualistic to collective key. For Freud, psychoanalysis frees the patient by giving him awareness of and thus a greater measure of control over the unthinkable wish. For the earlier Fanon, that is Fanon before the Algerian Revolution, the same trick could be pulled off at the social level. By showing racialized society how its psycho-existential complex operated, Fanon would free its members from it. More than just contributing to a third personal understanding of the colonial conjuncture, Fanon initially hoped that psychoanalysis could serve as a form of second personal address, resulting in a collective and liberating self-knowledge. But by the time of Wretched of the Earth, Fanon had seemingly abandoned this account of the political import of psychoanalysis. And that he did so is perhaps suggestive of that account's over-neatness. In the therapeutic setting, Freud says, the patient resists the emerging diagnosis. The patient Part of the patient does not want the knowledge that will set her free. And this is true even though the patient has chosen to enter analysis, and so is at some level prepared to treat herself as someone who does not wholly know herself. So it's unsurprising then in the sphere of politics, where as a rule no one asks to be analyzed, the provision of a diagnosis is often received as an assault on one's dignity. To treat someone psychoanalytically is to treat some aspect of her as a symptom, to be explained in terms of underlying causes rather than consciously held reasons. For Freud, psychoanalysis was the third impossible profession, along with teaching and governing, the profession of politics. In all three, he said, quote, "One can be sure beforehand of achieving unsatisfying results." For Freud, it made sense to think of governing as akin to teaching and analysis. For turn-of-the-century liberalism also endeavored to form rational persons out of the raw matter of human beings. But following the Second World War, liberalism grew wary of the project of subject formation, seeing it as a path to authoritarianism. For John Rawls, the most influential exponent of post-war liberalism, Freudianism, like Marxism, quote, destroys the game of reasoning by reducing men's opinions to hidden causes. In an unpublished paper from 1955, Rawls wrote, quote, "What disturbs us about psychoanalysis is that it suggests that the self is a system of powers which doesn't know itself in vital respects. What common sense takes for granted, Freud regarded as a rare and difficult achievement. Thus, what psychoanalysis might lead us to think is that people are not really or not fully persons." For Rawls, to treat one's fellow citizen as an analyst might treat her patient, to diagnose, say, her hostility towards immigrants as arising from an infantile drive for control, is to cease treating them as a person. And there's something to this. If we were all to engage each other all the time in the spirit of what Paul Ricoeur named, thinking of Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche, the hermeneutics of suspicion, we would drive each other quite literally mad. Social life would become impossible. And the contemporary culture war gives us, I think, a glimpse of this prospect. Now, psychoanalysis has no truck with the crude reductionism involved in saying that someone believes such and such just because they are a white, cis, straight, bourgeois male, any more than just because they are a queer, brown, female metropolitan elite. Indeed, one way of putting the core insight of psychoanalysis is that none of us simply is any of the categories under which we fall, no matter how much we might consciously identify with it. But it is imperative to read people as determined by more than the reasons they consciously avow. Psychoanalysis shares something with this reductionist reflex. And it's for this reason that Eve Sedgwick, in her essay Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading, observed that the choice to engage in a hermeneutics of suspicion is, quote, ethically very fraught, and should be seen as a strategic and local decision, not necessarily a categorical imperative. Freud, though one of the founding fathers of paranoid reading, would have actually agreed with Sedgwick. In a footnote to his 1931 paper, Female Sexuality, Freud writes, quote, "It's to be anticipated that our women analysts will disagree with what I have said here. They will hardly fail to object that such notions as penis envy spring from the masculinity complex of the male and are designed to justify on theoretical grounds his innate inclination to disparage and suppress women. But this sort of psychoanalytic argumentation reminds us here, as it so often does, of Dostoevsky's famous knife that cuts both ways. Male psychoanalysts will think it quite natural that the female sex should refuse to accept a view which appears to contradict their eagerly coveted equality with men. The use of analysis as a weapon of controversy can clearly lead to no decision. Psychoanalysis, Freud says, is a knife that cuts both ways. The Freudian can be put on the couch, just as the Marxist can be accused of dressing up his envy as class consciousness. When this happens, we arrive at a dialectical impasse. Psychoanalysis goes limp as a weapon of controversy. In the therapeutic setting, the patient's resistance is carefully managed, its energy redirected towards self-knowledge. But in politics, where there is no mutually agreed patient and doctor, where everyone thinks they're the doctor, it's less clear how, in such moments of impasse, to go on. In their recent book, Who's Afraid of Gender?, Judith Butler attempts to psychoanalyze trans-exclusionary feminism. Taking J.K. Rowling, a survivor of intimate partner violence, as a case study, Butler identifies a phantasmic sliding from a personal experience of male violence to the idea that all men are violent to the idea that trans women pose an existential threat to cis women. Butler writes, quote, "Violent crimes are real. Sexual violence is real, but living in the repetitive temporality of trauma does not produce an adequate account of social reality. None of us were violated by an entire class, even if it sometimes feels that way. To refuse to recognize trans women as women because one is afraid that they are really men and hence potentially rapists is to let the traumatic scenario loose on one's description of reality." As I read this bit of Butler's book, what I wanted to know was not whether the analysis was correct, but how it would be received. Would trans-exclusionary feminists see in it a welcome refusal to write them off as moral monsters? An attempt to empathize with their justified anxiety about male violence, even if not an endorsement of the politics in which that anxiety results? No. Kathleen Stock called Butler's account, quote, "a compendium of smears," and summed up the argument as follows, quote, "If you are anti-gender, then you are very probably a patriarchal, racist, Christian nationalist nutjob and also secretly gay. Butler is probing your unconscious, remember, and understands you better than you do yourself. Or perhaps, and this is about as charitable as it gets, you are simply a naive and credulous fool for whom getting in a moral panic about gay marriage and LGBTQ+ library books acts as a psychic substitute for reasonable fears about climate change and neoliberalism." Striking a similar note, the philosopher Nina Power writes of Butler's psychoanalytic reading that it is, quote, "remarkably handy if one wants to accuse people of holding beliefs they don't actually hold. Thus the Pope, Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, Giorgia Meloni, Viktor Orban, mothers on message boards, doctors and psychologists, and whoever else you don't like are all fundamentally bearers of the same bad thought. They have no good reasons for their position because all their motives are unconscious." Now, it would presumably not help to persuade Stock or Power to point out that their resistance to Butler's diagnosis would, for Freud, hardly be evidence of its falsity, and indeed, on the contrary, that it might be a sign that we are approaching what Freud would have called the pathogenic nucleus of trans-exclusionary feminism. In the ugly war over the trans question, the use of analysis as a weapon of controversy can clearly, as Freud says, lead to no decision. For Stock and Power are correct about this much. Psychoanalysis is not charitable in the philosophical sense of assuming the maximal rationality or self-knowledge of the other. Psychoanalysis involves not charity, but empathy, a willingness to see, even in the most rebarbative aspects of human behavior, a completely intelligible response to our shared condition. But with this substitution of empathy for charity comes the danger of what we might call hermeneutical domination. That in the name of liberating the other, we will in fact imprison her in our favored interpretation. And this danger has worried the critics of psychoanalysis and some of its practitioners from the start. Freud's associate, the Hungarian analyst Sándor Ferenczi, diagnosed, quote, "overkeenness in making interpretations as one of the infantile diseases of the analyst." The remedy, Ferenczi said, was for the analyst to cultivate some intellectual modesty and tact. It was Fanon's growing anxiety about the, quote, master-slave, prisoner-jailer dialectic of the traditional therapeutic relationship that led him to abandon the asylum as a model of care. Michel Foucault condemns Freud for freeing the madman from the asylum, only to arrogate to himself, quote, all the asylum's powers to watch, judge, and punish. Rawls, as we've already seen, thought psychoanalysis incompatible with the respect we owe each other as persons. Nowhere, though, do we find more anxiety about psychoanalysis as an authoritarian practice than in the work of Jacques Lacan, Freud's most influential interpreter. Using the same terms as Rawls, Lacan insists that psychoanalysis, quote, respects the person. For this reason, Lacan says, it would be, quote, paradoxical for the analyst to aim to break down the subject's resistance to secure acquiescence to an interpretation. In Freud, Lacan insists we find not hermeneutical domination, but, quote, a more nuanced attitude, that's to say, more humane. Now, underwriting this defense of Freud is Lacan's transformation of psychoanalysis from an archaeological science that seeks to reconstruct the actual infantile crisis that prompted the subject's repression into a structural endeavor that aims to articulate and thus reconfigure the subject's relationship to desire. The correctness of a psychoanalytic interpretation is no longer then primarily a matter of its historical accuracy. What matters most is the productivity of the analyst's intervention, that the analyst embody the enigmatic lack around which the subject's desire circulates, and that in turn the analyst is prompted to speak that which is currently unspeakable for her. In this Lacanian schema, the analyst transmits no hermeneutical expertise or etiological discovery to his patient, and indeed, on the contrary, the analyst must refuse the epistemic authority that the patient ascribes to him. Now, in fact, the analyst does know many things. The Lacanian analyst does know many things. That desire is by its nature unsatisfiable, that the ego is a merely fragile mask, that the analysand must come to assume responsibility for the structure of her desire. But this knowledge is to be operationalized, never performed. Indeed, the analyst must insist on a Socratic self-effacement. He knows, Lacan says, quote, nothing other than his own desire. Lacan thus contains the threat of hermeneutical domination by reimagining the analytic task. In making his case, he downplays, we might say, resists what we know of Freud's actual clinical practice. While treating the 18-year-old young woman he called Dora, whose real name was Ida Bauer, Freud repeatedly barraged his young patient with his diagnosis of her hysterical symptoms, namely that Bauer was in love with her father's friend, Herr K., whose sexual aggressions she had begun enduring at the age of 13 or 14, and which she had violently rejected. Freud took Bauer's repeated refusals of his interpretation as confirmations of it, just as Herr K. had taken Bauer's repeated rejection of his sexual advances for a secret yes. After 11 weeks of this ordeal, Bauer quit her treatment and Freud concluded it a failure, blaming it on her. Freud would later warn analysts not to ram interpretations down a patient's throat, as he had just done. As a rule, Freud wrote shortly before his death, quote, we put off telling the patient of a construction or explanation till he himself has so nearly arrived at it that only a single step remains to be taken. But Freud never renounced the idea that the analyst has expert knowledge and that it is the analyst's task to help his patient acquire that knowledge for herself. The analyst thus requires, Freud says, quote, some kind of superiority over his patient. It's hard not to bristle at that phrase, some kind of superiority. Hearing it, we should remember how often psychoanalysis has been recruited for projects of social repression, especially of female and queer sexuality. Lacan's horror of the analyst's enactment of epistemic superiority has its mirror in liberalism's horror of claims to privilege knowledge on the part of a designated class, sect, or nation, claims, as Rawls says, that destroy the game of reasoning. For Rawls, the remedy is to meet reason only with more reason. But for Lacan, this would amount to meeting the other's ego with one's own, when it is precisely the sense of ourselves as coherent wholes that must be ruptured. Reason for Lacan is not to be met with reason, but with what he calls oracular speech, gnomic utterances that disrupt the analysan's smooth understanding of herself. You say you cannot be safe as long as Palestinians want you dead. What dead do you want? There's a difference I want to suggest between allowing a fear of hermeneutical domination to shape our politics and making that fear the totality of our politics. A justified fear of hermeneutical domination must be balanced, I think, by a recognition, vital to any liberatory politics, that knowledge often resides precisely where ideology says it's least likely to be found. In 1931, Franci wrote some notes published with the extraordinary title, Aphoristic Remarks on the Theme of Being Dead, Being a Woman. He suggests that becoming a woman might be a process of traumatic adaptation, a partial death. If so, might this not explain, quote, the higher intellectual faculties found in women? In the moment of the trauma, Franci writes, quote, some sort of omniscience about the world, i.e. pure objectivity, pure intelligence, makes the person, the woman in question, more or less clairvoyant. The instant of dying, if perhaps after a hard struggle the inevitability of death has been recognized and accepted, is associated with that timeless and spaceless omniscience. We should hesitate, I think, to go all the way with Franci. Trauma is no guarantee of pure objectivity or omniscience. It would be a dangerous romanticism, for example, to think that the Gaza genocide will result only in greater psychic and moral clarity on the part of the Palestinians. Franci himself thought the traumatic mechanism that produced in women their omniscience also produced the capacity to take pleasure in self-destruction, the pathology of female masochism. But surely there's something to the idea that some people, in virtue of the place they are allotted in the world, do see some things more clearly than others. Indeed, see others more clearly than those others sometimes see themselves. We can ask, what is lost when this something is abandoned so that we can uphold politics as a game of reasoning? Is this game guaranteed to end in dignity? Can the occupier be trusted to know himself? Psychoanalytic practice is essentially dyadic, a collaboration between patient and analyst. In this sense, the use of psychoanalysis to illuminate politics in theoretical texts by Butler or Rose, Fanon or Firestone is not an instance of psychoanalysis, but an application of its theory. Here, the subject of the analysis cannot speak back. Resistance is almost guaranteed. And so it follows that the political import of psychoanalytic texts rarely comes from any transformation in the psyches of the subjects they analyze, from emancipating the minds of far-right populists, climate denialists, or genocide perpetrators. As political theory rather than praxis, psychoanalysis, I've tried to suggest, can do other things, and perhaps it's churlish to ask it to do more. But it's important, I think, to see that the distinctive connection between knowledge and freedom that Freud drew, operating through the crucial mechanism of second personal address, is in the standard way of bringing psychoanalysis to bear on politics no longer at work. This isn't meant as a criticism, but it may contain a warning. In a moment in which psychoanalytic theory is returning to the cultural center, but psychoanalysis as a practice remains rare, it is easy to forget what underwrites Freud's original promise to transform, that is, a conversation between self and other. So, too, is it easy to forget that from the psychoanalytic point of view, the will to greater and greater theoretical mastery can itself be a form of resistance to the real work of transformation. Indeed, I find it striking how few thinkers see psychoanalysis as a technical craft, the so-called talking cure that might make us more effective political agents, more endowed with the empathy and tact required to engage our fellow humans in hard conversations. In an essay in the 2020 Routledge Handbook of Psychoanalytic Political Theory, the psychoanalyst Sally Weintraub criticizes climate communicators for ignoring the role that disavowal plays in reproducing the climate crisis. Talk of ecological apocalypse is more likely to deepen impotence than to enliven agency. But Weintraub does not say what it would be to talk better about the climate crisis, how we might draw on psychoanalytic technique to work through climate disavowal. Here, psychoanalysis diagnoses, but it does not offer cure. Slavoj Žižek perhaps comes closest to modeling political action on psychoanalytic technique. Žižek celebrates what he calls the act, capital T, capital A, an intervention that would, he says, traverse the fundamental fantasy of the political order, just as the Lacanian analyst at the moment of cure ruptures his patient's relationship to the fantasy that sustains her falsely coherent sense of self. But for even Žižek, this is more analogy than it is application. Examples he gives of the act include the French and October revolutions, hardly instances of the attentive listening and sparse interjection that Lacan prescribes to analysts. If such instances are going to be found in politics, it will be in the practice known as organizing, the laborious task of persuading ordinary people that their sense of powerlessness conceals an untapped power. The most effective political organizers perhaps know already what psychoanalysts could teach them about unspoken fear and desire, listening more than speaking, even the workings of transference and projection. In the 1940s, the American civil rights leader Ella Baker traveled through the American South to organize poor Black people. Despite her relative privilege, Baker was middle class, university educated, lived in New York. She dressed with deliberate modesty. Reflecting on this choice, Baker said, quote, "I've had women come up to me and say, 'Your dress is just like mine.' And that's an identification. See, they don't know how to deal with the verbal part, but they are identifying with you. And instead of you turning up your nose to turn them off, you can say something that shows that that's good. We've both got good dresses." So Baker sees in the poor woman's comment, "Your dress is just like mine," nothing less than a moment of identification, not just with Baker, but more incipiently, more unconsciously, the content of Baker's speech, with the desire for Black liberation. And Baker answers with an affirmation of the unspeakable desire. Yes, we've both got good dresses. But not everyone is Ella Baker, with a preternatural ability to have hard conversations. The recentering of psychoanalysis in contemporary left thought provides perhaps a renewed impetus to see conversation as a technical craft. And in turn, a left that was better at having hard conversations, at listening to the desire behind the refusal, the anxiety behind the apathy, is a left that would have less reason to treat theory as a refuge to which to flee. For organizers, self-analysis is a means rather than an end. The aim of organizing, unlike that of psychoanalysis, is always collective action, with emphasis on both collective and action. And underlying this difference in aims is a subtly different account of the relationship between mind and action. For Freud, as for Plato, behavior flows from the psyche. The symptom speaks the truth of the subject's inner reality. To change behavior, we must first change the mind. And here is a moment of convergence between psychoanalysis and philosophy. For both presume that real change in our outward lives, are becoming ethically better, less neurotic, more capable, as Freud says, of love and work, requires first an internal epistemic shift, that knowledge sets us free. But organizing rests on the insight that the psyche can also flow from action, that what is sometimes needed to become the sort of subject who feels empowered to stand up to the boss or the police or the state is simply to act in some small way, as if you already were that sort of subject. To stand up and find yourself standing with others, find yourself winning with others. And then to find yourself a subject with a greater measure of freedom and power and more desire too than you ever knew. Thank you.